Thank you, Francis, and thank you, friends near and far. It is an honor to be invited to Pendle Hill to speak about something that has become core to my ministry and my faith-based activism, pursuing a just peace in Israel-Palestine. I must admit that I'm a latecomer to this long-standing Quaker concern, but I hope I'll have something useful to share with Quakers and with members of other faith communities who may have joined us tonight. Because in so many faith communities, the search and the struggle for moral clarity on Israel-Palestine is intense. I believe that it is especially important to engage this search and struggle after the horrifying atrocities and war crimes committed by the military wing of Hamas on October 7th in 2023, and the war crimes committed by the US-backed state of Israel in Gaza ever since. As many people of conscience around the world have come to understand, we must find a third way, a nonviolent path to a just peace that deserves to be supported by national government leaders, the UN, and very importantly, global civil society, including faith communities and human rights organizations. I'm happy to report many Quakers and Quaker organizations have been working for this third path for decades. Originally, when I was thinking about giving this talk, it wasn't in light of what's currently happening with the great escalation. So I thought I was going to go into a lot of history about things that Quakers have done. In this moment, I think we need to focus more recently. Quakers have been outspoken recently, both before and after October 7th. On March 10th, 2023, for example, two US Quaker organizations, the American Friends Service Committee and the Friends Committee on National Legislation, joined with 7 other Christian denominations and organizations, and they wrote a very powerful letter to President Biden and all the members of the US Congress. They began the letter saying, "We write you as leaders of the US-based Christian churches, agencies, and organizations committed to seeking a just peace for Palestinians and Israelis. Our institutions have been deeply involved in this pursuit for decades, inspired by the call and promise of Jesus Christ, who said, 'Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God.'" In this spirit, they explained, for more than a decade, many of our groups have been calling for action to end Israeli violations of Palestinian rights and for conditioning US military funding to Israel. We have noted the lack of accountability for Israeli killings of civilians, ongoing land expropriations, home demolitions, settlement expansion, movement restrictions, and other gross violations of Palestinian rights. And when I was in Israel and Palestine this June on a service learning trip, I saw all those things firsthand. They also noted that a growing number of legal experts and human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Al-Haq, B'Tselem, and Yesh Din, say the situation meets the international legal definition of apartheid. The urgency they expressed in this letter was triggered by what these Christian organizations saw as the rapidly deteriorating human rights situation and the rise of violence in both the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel. This is all before October 7th. They trace this directly to the early 2023 installation of the most extreme, far-right, and openly racist coalition government in Israel's 75-year history. While these Christian leaders expressed strong support for the hundreds of thousands of Israeli Jews who were participating in mass demonstrations at the time, and even general strikes, to protest the new governing nation coalition's threat to the rule of law, free speech, women's rights, and the rights of LGBTQ citizens of Israel. These Christians writing our government leaders also highlighted a concern that wasn't being addressed by this movement in Israel. As they noted in the letter, the new Israeli government came to power on a platform of supremacy, stating that only Israeli Jews have a right to sovereignty in the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. They then denounced the fact that Netanyahu and his ministers have promised to expand existing settlements, legalize outposts built on Palestinian land, and establish new settlements, all while moving to formally annex the West Bank to Israel. And they called, okay, and the other thing that I think is important by this statement on March 10th is that these US churches and church leaders argued that the US government bears at least partial responsibility for this reality because of its uncritical support politically, diplomatically, financially, and militarily for the government of Israel and its failure to demand accountability. The central policy demand of this letter, they spoke plainly. As Israel continues to violate the rights of the people living under its control, violating international law and principles of human rights, as well as US law, the US must end its military support of Israel, which amounts to $3.2 billion per year, which is the minimum of what we're giving. Currently, we've expanded that enormously. Now, 10 days after the October 7th attack, these same two Quaker organizations spoke with one voice in a joint statement with the Canadian Friends Service Committee, Quakers in Britain, Quakers Australia, Friends World Committee on Consultation, and the Quaker UN office. In that statement, these 7 Quaker organizations declared that decried the war crimes of both Hamas and the state of Israel. Many Quakers and Quaker organizations, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. And they called for 4 things: a ceasefire, a release of captives, the full restoration of humanitarian aid to Gaza, and very importantly, because those are the immediate concerns, to de-escalate the situation, but very importantly, they called for action to address the underlying injustice of the military occupation and inequalities underlying the situation in the long term. As they put it, further military action will not bring peace. We know this as Quakers who are committed to peace and as students of history. Then they said to Quakers everywhere that now is the time for strong moral resolve, spiritual fortitude, and immediate action to provide strong leadership for peace. Peace that addresses legitimate rights and needs and enables all parties to recognize the humanity of each other. Now, in local Quaker congregations and in our yearly meetings, regional associations of local congregations, Many grassroots Quakers agree with the sentiment of these letters and the goals. But I also think we have to be really honest to ourselves and admit that several do not, at least not yet. And for one thing, many rank and file Quakers in the US have not been students of history about the human rights situation in Israel, Palestine. Going back 75 to 100 years. And they do not know much about US policy towards the region. This leaves many well-meaning friends feeling confused and unsure about what they think. In January, for example, I was asked to give a talk about my participation in the service learning trip to Israel, Palestine, that's sponsored by the Friends United meeting and co-led by amazing leaders, North Carolina Quakers Max and Jane Carter. I was able to share my firsthand witnessing of the human rights abuses mentioned in the letter. And then afterwards, the person who organized my talk thanked me. And she said it was helpful to her because she only started paying attention to Israel, Palestine since October 7th. And it's understandable. Since October 7th and the horrifying aftermath in Gaza, she is not alone. Many Quakers in our local congregations are assimilating a lot of new information and are trying to play catch up and finding moral clarity on the question of Israel-Palestine. These folks are understandably hesitant to pass minutes endorsing the perspectives of the larger national and international Quaker organizations until they know a bit more. They are also understandably even more hesitant to join the Ceasefire Just Peace Coalition of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian groups that are lobbying the US leaders or engaging in nonviolent protest or civil disobedience to push these four goals. So please raise your hand in the barn and online if this describes you or someone you know in your local faith community. So I'm seeing a lot of hands, and so it's not alone. It's not uncommon among friends, and it's not uncommon among other religious communities either. Much more study and dialogue needs to be organized at the grassroots level and at the Religious Society of Friends and elsewhere before we can become a fully powerful and unleashed force for peace that is hoped for by the letter of the Seven Quaker Organization. And that is why I applaud so many of the educational efforts that Quakers are doing, often volunteer. And I want to mention a few, and we'll also send out some information after this, in the coming week, to give you resources to this. But this certainly includes the dogged ministry of Max and Jane Carter, taking people since the mid-90s every year and to Israel and Palestine, where you meet a wide diversity of people with different perspectives. It also includes New England Yearly Meetings grant program to support New England Quakers to go to Israel, Palestine, and then come back and report on what they saw to the meetings in the New England. And it certainly includes a class that I just finished that the Mideast Collaborative of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting puts on. It's a 6-week online course freely available to any Quaker anywhere that they run each year called Why Palestine Matters. There's also a lot of work by local peace and social concerns committees of various meetings and Quaker churches. And there's a national network called the Quaker Palestine Israel Network that also has a Facebook site, but also the individual members are doing educational work throughout various meetings and around the country. All these efforts are rooted in what I think is a great wisdom about how we should be in the world from the Faith and Practice book in New England Yearly Meeting. And this wise book reminds us, and I love this passage, and I try to live by it. Friends are called to help establish the kingdom of God on earth. Let us strengthen a sense of kinship with everyone. Let that kinship inspire us in our efforts to build a social order free of violence and oppression, in which no person's development is thwarted by poverty and the lack of healthcare, education, or freedom. Friends are advised to minister to those in need, but also to seek to know the facts and the causes of social and economic ills, and to work for the removal of those ills. Now, for those folks who are confused and playing catch up, all these educational resources are hugely important and are available to you. But if you only have time to read one book, it's a little old, but it'll give you the background of this whole conflict. And that, I would say, is the book When the Rain Returns Toward Justice and Reconciliation in Palestine and Israel, which was written by the International Quaker Working Group on Israel-Palestine and published by the American Friends Service Committee. This group of 14 Quakers from around the world were faithful to the advice that the New England Yearly Meetings Faith and Practice did. They did extensive background research about the history of the conflict between Zionist Jews and the Palestinian people. They traveled extensively in Israel, Palestine, and surrounding countries observing condition. They interviewed hundreds of Israelis and Palestinians of various perspectives. They then discussed over months their differing understandings of what they were learning from these talks with people. And then they held all that information in the light of the Quaker testimonies of peace, justice, equality, and truth. Finally, they wrote up a report, and the result is comprehensive, sensitive, and nuanced of the situation in Israel-Palestine, the failures of US policy toward the region, and they offered some nonviolent approaches towards peace, freedom, and human rights for everyone in Israel-Palestine that they had learned and were suggested by Israeli and Palestinian human rights activists. Now, that said, I also think there's a deeper problem that people in the Religious Society of Friends have to confront than just people beginning to pay attention and trying to catch up. If Quakers are going to play a powerful role in the ceasefire just peace movement in the US and around the world, we will have to face the challenge that some friends appear to be philosophically allergic to such open-ended discernment and education about the situation in Israel-Palestine, and that they believe any criticism of the state of Israel's human rights record or any empathy expressed for the plight and oppression of Palestinians is anti-Semitic and somehow supportive of terrorism. I know that there are a handful of friends at my Friends Meeting of Washington, where I'm a member, who hold such views, and they fundamentally disagree with the analysis, vision, and strategy put forth by the 7 Quaker groups. They see such statements as unjust and hostile to the legitimate rights of Israeli Jews. And they have been vocal in opposing our meeting, even endorsing proposals like ceasefire or humanitarian assistance. Now, the good news is my meeting, after many painful conversations over and over and over again, did reach a solid minute endorsing the proposals of the 7 organizations. So that's great. But I also found it interesting. Peace and Social Concern proposed a banner that we would be putting on our fence right in DuPont Circle in the center of Washington, D.C. And it had 3 messages. One was seek peace and pursue it, which is from a psalm. The other was using the Jewish Voice for Peace slogan, never again for anyone. And then the last thing was ceasefire now. And even after we had passed the minute supporting a ceasefire, there were objections at our business meeting that we would put a banner that would publicly say ceasefire now. And they also said, just 1 or 2 people were talking about never again should only be applied to Jewish victims of discrimination and mass murder. It should never be used for other ethnic groups. Now, most of the people at my meeting did not agree, but several people stood up in our meeting and said, well, we don't want to upset some of our members, so let's not put it up. So this means that the Friends meeting in our nation's capital could not find unity to say nobody should suffer genocide. And I've heard from around the country that other meetings are having huge trouble getting to the place where they're in unity to do something to create a just peace in Israel-Palestine. Now, I want to be fair. For all the flaws in moral reasoning I see in the arguments that were used against the banner, I believe that there are many generous and justice-loving impulses behind these friends' concerns. And I want to name them and honor them. A deep rejection of anti-Jewish bigotry, especially among Christians. That I think we can all embrace. A deep horror at the mass extermination campaign undertaken by the Nazis during the Holocaust. A justified dismay at the anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant attitudes by the general population and political leaders in both the United States and Britain during the Holocaust and after the war, where they refused to up their immigration quotas for persecuted Jews, though they felt it would be just fine to put the burden on Palestinians to take them in because they have a lot less power about their borders. A conviction that Jewish refugees also had a right to legally immigrate to Palestine, where their religion flourished 2,000 years ago. And one of the things I would say is I talked with a sheikh when I was in Palestine, in Ramallah, when we went to worship at a mosque and talk with people. And he said something that I think is so poignant. Most Palestinians have no objection to having Jewish neighbors. We only object to having Jewish masters. And I think another thing that these people are really, care about justice is a genuine desire to support Jewish safety, liberation, and renewal. I believe all of these legitimate moral concerns were what motivated Bayard Rustin, the inspirational Quaker civil rights and justice leader, to offer his complete and uncritical support of the State of Israel throughout his life. Before his death in 1987, Rustin regularly denounced the views of people, Quaker or not, who claimed that the State of Israel was in any way racist, fascist, imperialist, and the like. He also specifically rejected making connections between Israeli policy and the South African system of apartheid, which many in the civil rights movement were already beginning to make that connection. Rustin just could not see the State of Israel as an oppressor of the Palestinian people, no matter what the evidence was. In fact, he saw most Arabs, including Palestinians, as backward, violent, and anti-Semitic, would-be oppressors of the Jewish people. Justice for him was defending the State of Israel at any cost. Now, while many Quakers felt Rustin went one step too far, on June 28, 1970, when he placed full-page ads in both the New York Times and the Washington Post, asking Nixon to increase military support for the State of Israel. Many people, many friends at the time and still have that sense of we cannot criticize Israel for human rights violations. And I get that you want to protect the people who have been discriminated against and have faced mass extermination, but truth, justice, and equality matter. Now, like some members of my meeting, Rustin did not dig much deeper than his social justice concerns that I think are legitimate into what was actually happening on the ground. And in contrast to other Black human rights leaders at the time, like Martin Luther King, the leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and certainly Malcolm X, Rustin rigidly held on to his belief that the State of Israel can do no wrong. Unfortunately, Rustin's one-sided view does not take into account the important warning articulated all the way back in 1934 at a conference of US and Canadian rabbis exploring how to respond to the growing persecution and oppression of Jews in the new Nazi government. At that gathering, the conference president, Rabbi Samuel Goldenson, sounded like rabbis who work with Jewish Voice for Peace today. And he said at the podium, realizing then, as everyone must, that in the spread of intolerance, we Jews are always the first victims, it behooves us to be especially watchful of our own conduct and to not commit the folly of believing that similar illiberalisms may not develop among ourselves. Quakers can and should have human sympathy for any religious group that develops illiberalisms within their community, as we ourselves have done so many times. In our history, our most honest historians have documented how Quakers struggled with each other for over 100 years to decide as a group that slavery was a horrendous sin. They have also documented the complicity of Quakers benefiting from the settler colonial project in Pennsylvania and other qualities, as many Quakers sought to flee the persecution in England. Just read the charter given to William Penn by King George. That text is riddled with the evils of the Christian doctrine of discovery, which declares non-Christian natives can be driven from their lands and killed if they oppose colonization by European Christians. We also owe repentance and reparations to the generations of Native children and families we harmed through the pious but white supremacist and culturally genocidal practices of our Indian boarding schools, a program that spanned decades. We have not always been faithful to the best of our faith tradition. And clearly, Zionist Jews are not at all unique in being tempted to undertake a morally questionable settler colonial strategy in a desperate attempt to secure human rights and safety for their own community. Nor should they be demonized for this moral lapse. Both the early European and American Zionists lived within a larger Euro-American culture, rife with the casual acceptance of racism, ethno-nationalism, militarism, and colonialism. And let's remember the conditions of our oppression do condition us, which we should understand as a very human response, but still work to challenge and transform them as faith-based activists. And this also goes for having human understanding for the desperation, the frustration, and the desire for revenge by Hamas, even if we can't agree and need to find a different way. We therefore, I think, need to be patient but resolute as we labor with our own members in the Religious Society of Friends who, at least to my mind, seem one-sided and not having full enough empathy for everyone who lives between the river and the sea. Now, it took a lot of internal struggle, persuasion, education, prayer, dialogue, and deep spiritual discernment to come out as a body against slavery. Quakers today need to engage in a similar struggle around Israel-Palestine, but given the horrendous stakes right now, we need to engage in this as well as we can and as fast as we can. Now, happily, I stand before you as a poster child of somebody who can change. I agreed completely as a teenager and a person in my 20s with Bayard Rustin on Israel-Palestine and so many other things. Most of the other things I still agree with Bayard. But I grew up offering a fierce and uncritical support of Israel policies that disregarded human rights. And I shifted to somebody who eventually came around, and this took decades, to publicly commit myself to a ministry and a faith-based activism for a just peace. And I wrote about this transformation, personal transformation, in my Pendle Hill pamphlet, which I was so grateful that they would publish, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction, A Quaker Zionist Rethinks Palestinian Rights. And it tells the story of this change. And in the piece, I laid out my starting assumptions, which were identical to Rustin's. Like a lot of US Quakers of my generation, I knew a lot about the Holocaust. I had a lot of Jewish friends. I thought that Zionism was a totally just Jewish liberation movement. I knew nothing about the 1947-48 Nakba that killed over 15,000 Palestinians, destroyed over 500 Palestinian villages, and expelled nearly 800,000 Palestinians from their homes, farms, and businesses, and were never allowed to return. That constituted 3/4 of the Palestinian population being expelled, ethnically cleansed from what became the state of Israel in 1948. And I have to admit, during this period, I also viewed Palestinians through an unconscious racist lens, just like Rustin. And I saw the Palestinian people and Arabs generally as backward, violent, and anti-Semitic. I also believe that all Jews fully supported the goals of Zionism and the policies of the State of Israel, which is definitely not true in history or now. Now, how did I shift my perspective? To eventually come out in full support of the AFSC's decision to endorse the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, which is an international nonviolent campaign to pressure Israel and various institutions that support its current apartheid regime and have them actually embrace human rights law. I'll tell you, it was through the persuasive arguments and the passion of other people who challenged me to become less racist and more faithful to the Quaker testimonies of truth, peace, justice, and equality. Now, the first crack in my unquestioning view of Zionism in my 20s was, and it widened in my 30s, as more and more of my Jewish friends were traveling and either living in Israel for a period of time or visiting. And they came back and told me about how conflicted they were. There was so much they loved about Israeli society. There is so much they loved about being in such a vibrant and diverse Jewish community. And they loved that. But they also talked to me about there's a very rightward drift going on. The militarism is intense. And while they don't believe all Israelis should be called racist, they said so many Zionists, and especially including the settlers, were profoundly racist against the Palestinians. And it was shaking them to the core, and they were rethinking. And my friends who I trusted, progressive folks who were coming back with this, I had to start thinking about, well, do I still agree with my ideas? And then in my 30s, one of my Jewish friends handed me a book called The Other Israel. And it's an anthology of Israeli and Jewish dissidents who are opposing the State of Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people. And I read the whole book, but one essay really challenged me. And it was by a Knesset member, an elected member of the legislature in Israel. I probably am messing up his name, but Shulamit Aloni. And he wrote, whoever claims that the settlements are Israel's catastrophe from a security and economic point of view is not an anti-Semite, but a patriot. Whoever says that this government is committing crimes against humanity is not an anti-Semite, but an honest and humane person. I now had to ask myself, as the editors wanted me to, of this book, had I allowed my heartfelt support for the Jewish people become an uncritical endorsement to the repressive measures used to enforce Israel's occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip? Was I being a well-meaning but misinformed person complicit in injustice? Was my country, for its own foreign policy reasons, enabling our nation's #1 aid recipient to oppress the Palestinian people? These questions led me to start a more critical study of the history of Zionism, the State of Israel, its policies, and both Jewish and Palestinian resistance to Israel's policies towards the Palestinians. It also led me to seek out much more knowledgeable Quakers who had been dealing and working on this issue for years, decades. And I learned a lot, and both in the QPIN, Quaker Palestine Israel Network, and among AFSC staffers. And I was also very blessed about 10 years ago to become friends with Palestinian Quakers and hear for the first time stories about what it was like for their families to be dispossessed, to be displaced, and live through the Nakba and live through, and my friend Syed Atshan lived his entire life when he was in Palestine under military occupation, and he went to the Ramallah Friends School. And that completed, I think, my transformation, though I'm still learning more and trying to figure out what my ministry can be. But the good news here, and why I tell this story, is that by engaging and challenging other people in our communities to think deeper, to think about our testimonies, works. It can happen. Change can happen at the individual level, but it can also happen in the entire religious society, friends. And I think that's hopeful. Now, that said, there's another transformation that I think many people, and this is directed to people who agree with wanting to be part of the ceasefire, just peace movement. And if we're going to be a bold contributor to this movement, and if we're especially going to have the backs of the brave Jewish activists in groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace, and the Arab and Palestinian human rights organizations who are leading nonviolent resistance campaigns all across this country and around the world for what many consider a potential or unfolding genocide in Gaza, we need to make this transformation. And I want to illustrate it by telling a little known story of Quaker history that I think is a good challenge for us to know about. In June 1934, as the rise of Nazi fascism was causing alarm around the globe, Professor Henry Cadbury, then the AFSC's chair, gave a keynote address to the Central Conference of American Rabbis. In his talk, Cadbury told the assembled Jewish leaders to love Nazis, to seek only dialogue and negotiations with them, and, quote, not fight back in any way. He specifically urged the rabbis not to support the ongoing boycott movement to pressure the German regime to change its anti-Semitic policies. He even went on to say boycotts and all nonviolent resistant tactics used by Gandhi in the struggle for Indian independence were simply war without bloodshed. He said such warlike tactics should be avoided by all adherents of the Judeo-Christian faith tradition. He argued that the strategy of non-resistance would put an end to Nazi persecution of Jews more effectively and far earlier than any form of resistance. Now, Cadbury's advice to the rabbis, and I have to explain that both he and the AFSC later rejected his advice, was not at all well received by the rabbis. Samuel Schuman, the honorary president of the conference, declared that he could not in good conscience subscribe to the principle of non-resistance to evil, which Dr. Cadbury advocated. Rabbi Stephen Wise, who the New York Times reported led a wave of objection to the advice of Professor Henry Cadbury, said from the conference podium, a boycott is a rightful refusal to not have any relation morally or economically with any government which has persecuted us and done injustice to our people. Wise added, a boycott is not war, it is a moral and economic weapon of self-defense. Ultimately, the conference participants adopted a resolution rejecting Cadbury's advice and inserted instead, quote, moral persuasion should be supplemented by every manner of nonviolent resistance whenever people face violent repression, social injustice, economic marginalization, and systematic inequality or persecution. Cadbury, the AFSC, and many, many Quakers ultimately came to agree with the wise counsel of these rabbis. And they supported the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, 1956. They supported the use of nonviolent resistance tactics throughout the civil rights movement and the US anti-Vietnam War movement of the 60s. But today, however, in my meeting and in other meetings that I'm hearing about, many of us are still hesitant to participate in nonviolent resistance and to support it, even when we support ceasefire and the idea of a just peace. And I therefore think we need to support and move towards a more robust faith-based activism that embraces lobbying, persuasive peace building, and nonviolent resistance. Especially when we're facing the US government's support for Israel's military occupation, its apartheid regime, and its ongoing campaign of, if it's not genocide, it is at least mass murder, displacement, and the systematic withholding of food, medicine, healthcare, water, housing, and power to run the grid to most of the people of Gaza. Now, I think there's good news in the midst of the horror we're in. The movement that's emerging and growing, and sort of the majority worldview at this point, and has sympathy by 55% of the American people, is changing global public opinion and pressuring Western governments, one, to restore the funding to the UN agency that provides humanitarian aid. And Canada and Ireland, as well as other countries, have put an arms embargo to Israel. And that's pretty impressive. And the International Court of Justice has put provisional sort of first steps demanding that Israel does certain things to meet law. And one of them is to stop starving the people of Gaza. This weekend, tens of thousands of Israelis were doing demonstrations, and a lot of them were led by family members whose hostages are being held in Gaza. And they were saying the biggest obstacle to getting the hostages released is that it's in Netanyahu's personal interest not to end this war, not to come to an agreement with Hamas and do a prisoner swap. And so they're calling for new elections. They're calling for a shift in the policy. And several people were chanting ceasefire. This is impressive in a time where just a month ago, an Israeli Jewish history teacher, school teacher, put on his social media that he has compassion for the children of Gaza. He was fired and he was put in jail for aiding and abetting terrorism. So these people are giving up fear. They're giving up this pressure to stop democracy, and they're openly demonstrating. And we should, I think, be as helpful as we possibly can. Now, one of the joys of staying for a time at Pendle Hill is in the meal line, when you're getting your food, you're likely going to be meeting some really major and impressive social justice activists, thought leaders. And 2 weeks ago, when I was preparing this talk, I had the exhilarating chance of, in the breakfast line, in the morning of meeting Michelle Alexander, who was here for a personal retreat. And for those of you who don't know who Michelle is, she is a passionate human rights lawyer who wrote the book, The New Jim Crow, which is talking about how mass incarceration is used in this country as the newest version of a racial caste system. So there was slavery, then there was the apartheid Jim Crow, and now this is a way that you can say, in a colorblind way, we can, discipline and make Black folks submit. And she and I got to talking, and she's also come out very strongly for the rights of Palestinian in the New York Times and other places. And I thanked her. It was such a great thing to say, just thank you for your service. Thank you for your work for justice all these years. And then we got to talking. We discovered we had the same two heroes, which is Vincent Harding and Martin Luther King, who collaborated together in 1967 to prepare King's speech that he gave at the Riverside Church on April 4th, where he publicly came out after for 2 years being against the war in Vietnam. He finally publicly came out in an extremely strong way. I think it's called A Time to Break Silence on the Vietnam War was the speech. And we just talked about how we're going to get through this moment and this time. It means that the only way, the thing that can save us is radical love. As embodied by King's liberation theology and his faith-based activism. So well. And I therefore want to close this talk with the last lines of King's talk, because I think it speaks so much to this moment. Let us now begin. Now, let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. This is the calling of the children of God. And our brothers and sisters wait eagerly for our response. Shall we say the odds are too great? Shall we tell them the struggle is too hard? Or will there be another message of hope, of longing, of solidarity with their yearnings, a commitment to their cause, whatever the cost? The choice is ours. And though we might prefer it to be otherwise, we must choose in this crucial moment of history. Thank you all for your time and attention. And I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Thank you.
Friends, thank you. Thank you for showing up, each of you, exactly where you are in your personal journeys. And thank you, Steve, for sharing your journey with us. I think there's great hope in this promise that we're able to continue to learn, that there's more to know than we already know, and that we can learn it with each other. So this is the time when we invite you into this conversation with Steve. For those online, if there are questions that have arisen, questions of clarification, curiosities to know more about what Steve has shared, you can share them with the tech Q&A host. Given our technical situation, I think Anne is going to read aloud some of those questions, and Steve will repeat them back in the microphone so that people online can hear them well. Thank you, Kendra. Kendra is going to pass around note cards. If you didn't already take one for friends in the room, please take a note card and you can write a question on it and hold it up, and I'll come and collect them. And I will also take turns with Anne reading questions to Steve that he'll repeat back into the microphone. But we'll invite us into, again, a few moments of worshipful silence as we let Steve's words land with us and let questions rise.
So, Anne, are there any questions online? Why don't you tell us one?
There are two so far. One is from Cynthia. She asks, are you familiar with Quaker peace building perspective? An informal international group. A group meeting twice weekly for almost 2 years, both Russia, Ukraine, and Palestine.
I am familiar, and I think work like this is hugely important. So when I talk about the importance of nonviolent resistance, I am not saying that peace building and dialogue and behind the scenes diplomacy is not valued. I see it as both and. Is there a question in the barn that somebody's finished writing on a card that Francis can pick up? Oh, yes. I'm sorry. So I'm sorry, folks online. The question was about Quaker peace building group that's been meeting and working around both Russia and Ukraine, but also Israel, Palestine for at least about 2 years. And so my response was, I do know a bit about them and I totally support their work. We have other questions?
Are you, sorry.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any movements in the US to withhold tax as there was during the war in Vietnam?
That's a great question. I don't offhand know of like a name of an organization and a URL that you could go to, but my hunch is that may be a tactic that several people will choose to do. Absolutely. And there's all sorts of forms of non-cooperation. One of the things about nonviolent resistance is people think of it often as sort of in the street persuasive demonstrations, but there's specific campaigns long-term where you're identifying a decision maker and targeting that. And there's also other kinds of tactics which don't even mean that you go into the street, but you non-cooperate with a system that is enabling an injustice. And so there's, for folks who don't know, Gene Sharp came up with 198 different tactics. And the reason there's 198 is his dissertation committee said this is getting too long, stop it. There's a lot more tactics that people have been invented. And then in Nonviolence International, a member of Friends Meeting of Washington, Michael Beer, has done a nice anthology that is talking about 350 tactics that can be used, and that they have an online database that you can add tactics that aren't in their list that your groups might be trying to use. So I definitely think we shouldn't think that there's, quotes, a magic bullet tactic, but that we need to be creative and we need to be strategic. We need to use lobbying, diplomacy, back channels, and nonviolent resistance. And I'll repeat the question this time. That's great. So the question is, what might I know about the Apartheid Free Communities initiative? And I'm excited. When I do the talk about my reflections on the trip in June to Israel, Palestine, which I didn't mention any of the details, but towards the end, I talk about apartheid free. And for those of you who don't know, currently, about 300 organizations have signed a pledge that their organizations will no longer be complicit with Israeli apartheid, and that they will each think, okay, that's our aspiration. How do we move towards that? And I'm also proud to say that the staff that is coordinating this, even though it's multi-interfaith, mostly US, but some other folks, is the American Friends Service Committee. So you can find out about this, but it's apartheid-free.org. And you can go. Several friends meetings and at least one yearly meeting have already signed on. I think it would be great if more meetings did it. And then you're in a network. You get newsletters, there's quarterly calls, and you can get good ideas from what other organizations and congregations are doing about how to move forward on this aspiration of not being complicit with apartheid. And that might mean if your congregation has investments, you might want to think through that really carefully. And there's also the AFSC related to this has an economic tactics or economic advisory where you can go and look through corporations that are benefiting and profiting from injustice on a number of issues, but also specifically on Israel-Palestine. And the AFSC has joined a larger coalition, and you can read more about it on their website, of boycotting Chevron because of their having leases of the oil right off of Gaza in the sea.
This is a question you may have anticipated. Given the stated intentions of Israeli leaders and the policies of mass killing, indiscriminate bombing, and deprivation of water, food, and healthcare, why have you used the language, what some people consider to be genocide? There should not be equivocation.
I agree. I wanted to name that several international human rights and international law lawyers and the International Court of Justice are saying South Africa has a plausible case of genocide against Israel. I also, if somebody just can't get through that word, but mass murder and the withholding of food and medicine and healthcare gets to them, I wanted to use that language as well. But I agree, it's time to be blunt, plain speaking, and to say the truth. I personally believe this is an unfolding genocide. It's happening now. And if you've ever asked yourself, well, what would I have done during the Nazi years? This is a good time to ask yourself, what am I going to do now? And next question.
take these two here. I want so much, or I can read and have a response to these things that are more than a paradigm of the democratic. I think you spoke to this, but is there anything else you would say about us staying rooted in a genuine corporate spiritual response?
So the question is wanting to rise above just sort of democratic talking points to having a spiritually grounded witness and movement. And I actually think on this issue, that's pretty easy because the support, the military support, the diplomatic support is bipartisan. There is a small group of Democrats that are becoming more and more vocal, and they are growing in Congress. But even though the vast majority of registered Democrats oppose this war, think that military aid should be conditioned, if not stopped completely, our national Democratic leaders, by and large, aren't changing course. And while Biden has been pressured by the movement so far to change his rhetoric and calling for more humanitarian aid, and then this last weekend, adding billions of dollars of weapons that make the aid so needed. So I think we take a principled stand, and if Democrat decision makers who are representatives are taking a horrible position, we push them. We hold their feet to the fire. We make them accountable. And it's tough in an electoral system structured the way the United States is, which just gives you two parties that have a chance of winning national office, with the exception of Vermont, God bless you, is that, but we can't be partisan about this. This is basic, equality and justice. And currently, our government is complicit under international law with genocide. And so we can't go, oh, well, but it's a Democrat. We couldn't possibly criticize them. We have to criticize them. We have to work with them. We have to talk with them. We have to educate.
Steve, I feel we're just at the beginning of a conversation, which is true. We're lucky that you have offered to stay here to talk with friends who are here on campus with us after the close of this session, because there are a number of questions we won't be able to get to. And there will be other opportunities to learn and continue this conversation with Steve as well. In May, we will be holding the Quaker Institute May 2nd to 5th, which will be here on campus. The theme this year is living our testimonies in the fierce urgency of now, quoting the Beyond Vietnam speech that you referenced today. And Steve will be giving a workshop at that gathering of friends as we learn together about how we can show up in this political moment. Steve will be also be hosting a reading group in May, in the middle of May, online, so friends can join as well to continue this conversation in the spirit of worship sharing. And many other opportunities to continue to learn together. I think you have pushed us today to realize the urgency of the moment that we're in. And I hope that we all leave with that sense of urgency and also the faithfulness to continue learning together. I want to invite us into a moment of worship to hold everything that has been shared and all the open questions. And thank you for joining us.